I always figured there were two kinds of fires, the ones you could see and the ones you couldn't. The first, you put out with water and grit. The second, the ones that burned in the gut, well, those took something else entirely. I'd spent my life facing both. Name's Elias Moore. 61 years old, retired firefighter, now running a small farm outside Rockside, Montana. Raised 4 kids on my own after my wife passed, made sure they had food on the table and a roof over their heads. That was the job, and I never asked for a thank you. These days, I split my time between the farm, my grandkids, and making sure I don't get too soft. A man needs work even if it ain't running into burning buildings anymore. Which is why it didn't sit right the way things had been feeling off lately. Not the kind of thing you could see straight on, but the way the air feels before a storm. Yasmin, my wife of 15 years, had always been polished, good taste, sharp mind, knew exactly how to work a room. It's what drew me to her in the first place. But lately, that sharpness had turned into something else. She was distant. Quiet when she used to be full of ideas about remodeling the house or some charity event in town. Said she was tired. That had been the excuse for a while now. Then there were the phone calls cut short the second I stepped into the room. The sudden interest in getting dressed up for errands. The way she turned her phone face down at dinner. I wasn't born yesterday. Everything all right, Lil? I asked one night as she set her purse by the door. It was nearly 9, later than she usually stayed out. She barely looked at me. Oh. Yeah. Just a long day. I watched her as she poured herself a glass of wine, her movements careful, practiced. The kind of care a person takes when they're balancing on a lie. Where'd you go? I asked, keeping my voice even. She hesitated just long enough for me to notice. Lunch with Melissa. Then I ran some errands. Melissa had moved to Denver last year. I let it sit. If you cornered a person too fast, they just lie harder. 2 days later, Tom Rodriguez, my neighbor, stopped by. We'd known each other 20 years, ever since he'd lost his wife to cancer. Stocky guy, always in the yard with a shovel in one hand and a beer in the other. He leaned on the porch railing, wiping his forehead with the back of his wrist. Saw Yasmin in town yesterday, he said. Looked like she was in a hurry. I kept my face neutral. That right? Yeah. Tom glanced at me, hesitated. She was with some fella. Didn't recognize him. Dark suit, real put together. Thought maybe it was business or something. Business? Sure. I nodded, let the words sink in like water into dry wood. The final confirmation came when I took a trip into Billings for supplies. I was standing outside a cafe waiting on a coffee when I heard someone say my name. Mr. Moore. You're from Rockside, right? I turned to see a guy in a bright red tour guide uniform, name tag reading Andy. He had that wide-eyed enthusiasm of a man who really liked his job. Guilty, I said, shaking his hand. Oh man, small world. I was giving a historical tour last week and I'm pretty sure I saw your wife. Elegant lady, blonde, right? My stomach turned to stone. That's so? Yeah, she was with this guy, a real sharp-looking, like a politician. They were at the high-end places. Thought maybe it was an anniversary trip or something. Or something, I muttered. I didn't even finish my coffee. That night, I sat at the kitchen table, turning a pocket knife over in my hands, feeling the weight of it. I'd fought fire for most of my life, but this was different. Firefighters don't rush into a blaze without a plan. You size it up first. Look for weak points. Figure out how to make sure it doesn't spread. Yasmin thought she was smart keeping it quiet. Thought she could have her secret life and come home to the man who paid for it all. She didn't realize I just declared war. And I never lost a fight. I didn't sleep much that night. Instead, I sat in my chair on the porch, listening to the wind move through the trees, thinking. Firefighting taught me something most men don't learn until it's too late. You don't charge into a burning building without knowing what's inside. Yasmin had built a little world where she could lie to my face and expect me to smile through it. That meant she thought I was either too stupid to notice or too weak to do anything about it. Either way, she was wrong. By morning, I had a plan. First thing, I drove into town and parked outside Blake Allen's shop, a small tech repair place squeezed between a thrift store and a diner. Blake was in his early 20s, smart kid, but spent too much time hunched over a screen. He looked up from behind a counter stacked with half-disassembled laptops, shoving his glasses up his nose. Mr. Moore, he said, surprised. Didn't expect to see you here. I nodded toward the back of the shop. Got a minute? Blake hesitated, glanced around, then led me to a small room cluttered with wires and circuit boards. I closed the door behind us. I need you to find something for me, I said. Blake scratched his chin, wary. Depends on what it is. Emails. Messages. Financial records if you can. I met his eyes, let the weight of my voice settle in. My wife's been stepping out. I need proof. He exhaled through his nose, sat back in his chair. That's a lot of gray area, Mr. Moore. I pulled a thick envelope from my jacket and placed it on the table. No gray area. I need to know the truth. Blake stared at the money, then at me. He wasn't stupid. He knew better than to ask if I was sure. Give me a few days, he said. That was step one. Back home, I kept things normal. Yasmin was sharp, but she was used to having control. If I started acting different, she'd sense it. So, I made sure to kiss her cheek before I left for town, asked about her day, even played along when she mentioned some made-up shopping trip with a friend. The whole time, I watched her. Noticed the way she avoided my eyes, how she tensed when her phone buzzed. She had no idea I was already 5 steps ahead. 3 days later, Blake called. I met him behind his shop, away from prying eyes. I got everything, he said, handing me a USB drive. Emails, texts, some credit card statements. She's been meeting a guy named Richard Stevens, Rick, mostly. Real estate guy. Big shot developer from Billings. I already knew who Rick was. We'd had beers together at barbecues, shook hands at town events. The bastard had eaten at my table. Blake shifted uncomfortably. You sure you want to see all of it? Some of it's explicit. I need all of it. He nodded. If you ever need a firewall installed, it's on the house. Back home, I plugged the USB into my laptop. The screen filled with messages, pictures, dates. There was no question now. Rick, God, I hate sneaking around. I wish we didn't have to. Yasmin, I know, baby. Elias would never understand. Rick, I just want to be with you. Completely. Yasmin, soon. I promise. I scrolled through transaction records. Hotel bookings. Fancy dinners. Gifts. And one purchase that made my blood run cold, a diamond bracelet from a jeweler in Billings, bought just last week. The receipt sat open on the screen, taunting me. I leaned back, breathing slow and deep. This wasn't just some fling. She was planning something. I shut the laptop, my pulse steady. I'd spend my life being the man people turned to when things fell apart. I'd pulled men from burning buildings, carried children on my back through smoke and flame. I wasn't about to fall to pieces because my wife thought she could humiliate me. I poured myself a drink, sat by the window, and thought through my next steps. A man like Rick had weaknesses. He was rich, sure, but men like that didn't build fortunes without cutting corners. I needed something that would ruin him beyond just this affair. Yasmin, on the other hand, needed to feel the weight of what she'd done in a way she'd never recover from. One thing was certain, when I was done, neither of them would come out unscathed. The next morning, I drove out to see Tom Rodriguez, my neighbor. He was in his front yard, cutting back some overgrown bushes with a pair of old clippers. When he saw me pull up, he set them down and wiped his hands on his jeans. Elias, he said, nodding. Something on your mind? I stepped out of the truck and leaned against the hood. Need a favor? Tom arched an eyebrow. That's so. I didn't sugarcoat it. I need people talking. His expression didn't change, but I saw the wheels turning. Tom had lived in Rockside long enough to know that news spread best through the people who weren't supposed to be spreading it. I told him just enough, how Yasmin had been meeting Rick in Billings, how it wasn't just some innocent lunch meetings. Tom exhaled, shook his head. Damn shame. And here I thought Rick was just another suit. He's a snake. But I want this done right. No direct accusations. Just enough to make people start watching closer. Tom rubbed his chin, thinking. Yasmin's got that charity thing next weekend, doesn't she? Whole town's gonna be there. I nodded. That's the place. Tom grinned. Consider it handled. By the time I left, I knew the first embers had been set. People in town loved a scandal, and when whispers started, they spread like wildfire. Yasmin wouldn't notice at first, she'd be too caught up in whatever fantasy she'd built with Rick. But soon, she'd feel the shift, that moment when people started looking at her just a little too long, conversations quieting when she walked by. Meanwhile, I had business in Billings. I called in a favor with an old friend, Gabriel Sutton, a former cop who now worked private security. We met at a diner off the highway, the kind of place where the coffee was always burnt and the waitress called you Han. Gabriel slid into the booth across from me, taking his time with his coffee before he spoke. So, you want dirt on Richard Stevens? I slid a folder across the table. Inside were the emails, the transaction history, every bit of proof Blake had dug up. Gabriel flipped through it, whistled low. Damn. She's got a type, huh? I didn't respond. He leaned back. All right. Stevens has got a reputation. Keeps his public image clean, but I know for a fact he's played dirty with land deals. Overvalued sales, kickbacks to city officials. If he's screwing around, he's probably screwing people over financially too. That's what I'm counting on. Gabriel drummed his fingers on the table, thinking. You want this done legal or loud? Both, I said. Find me something solid. Something that can't be brushed off. Gabriel nodded. Give me a few days. That was all I needed. Back home, Yasmin was in the kitchen when I walked in, wearing one of her expensive blouses, hair perfect like she was about to walk into a photo shoot. I set my keys down on the counter, watching her. You're home late, she said without turning around. Had some business in Billings. She froze for half a second, then recovered. Oh? Anything interesting? Not really, I said, keeping my voice even. Saw a few familiar faces, though. That time she tensed. I didn't say anything else. Let her stew in it. The next morning, Tom's work had already started paying off. At the general store, people were talking casual at first, nothing too obvious. Did you hear about that big developer from Billings? One woman murmured to another. Rick Stevens? Oh, I heard plenty. Some funny business going on with his projects, they say. By the time the charity event rolled around, everyone was listening. Yasmin walked into the Rockside Community Hall like she always did, shoulders back, smile perfect, greeting people by name. But something was off. Instead of the usual warmth, there was hesitation. Politeness, but not friendliness. I stood near the back, watching it unfold. She noticed me, gave me the same carefully practiced smile she'd been giving for years. I tipped my hat. Tom appeared next to me, sipping a soda. She's feeling it, he said under his breath. Good. Then, just as planned, Andy the tour guide made his entrance. He didn't know he was part of the plan, of course. But he had a way of talking too much at just the right time. Mrs. Moore, he said cheerfully, shaking her hand. Good to see you again. You and your husband ever end up taking that Billings trip together? Silence. I watched Yasmin's face shift just for a second before she recovered. I think you must be mistaken. Andy frowned. No, I remember. I gave a tour last month. You and that man, real sharp-dressed guy, you were, She cut him off with a laugh that was just a little too forced. Oh, Andy, you must be confused. Excuse me for a moment. She slipped away toward the back, her smile cracking just slightly. Tom nudged me. Well, that was fun. I didn't smile. I was just getting started. Yasmin didn't say much that night. She went through the motions, set her jewelry on the nightstand, wiped her makeup away, climbed into bed beside me like everything was fine. But I could feel the tension in the air, thick as smoke before a blaze takes hold. I didn't say anything either. I wanted her to sit with it, let the walls of her little world start closing in. She'd spent months sneaking around, lying to my face, thinking she had it all under control. Now, for the first time, she was the one scrambling. The next morning, I drove out to Gabriel Sutton's office in Billings. He had a place above an old boxing gym, the kind where the walls smelled like sweat and bad decisions. When I stepped inside, he was behind his desk, leaning back with his boots up, flipping through a stack of papers. You're gonna like this, he said, waving a manila folder at me. I sat down and opened it. Inside were documents, land acquisitions, bank transfers, emails between Rick and city officials. Turns out your pal Rick's been busy, Gabriel said, tapping the papers with a pen. Overvaluing properties, securing contracts with the right kind of handshakes. He's got a few officials in his pocket, but nothing I can't expose. I flipped through the pages. It was worse than I'd hoped. Rick wasn't just a cheat, he was a crook. This enough to sink him? I asked. Gabriel smirked. Oh yeah. Send this to the right people and he'll be lucky if all he loses is his business. That was all I needed to hear. I took the folder, shook Gabriel's hand, and left. Back in Rockside, I stopped by Tom's place. He was in his yard, kicking dirt over some weeds, a beer sweating in his hand. I tossed the folder onto his porch table. You still got that cousin at the Billings Gazette? Tom wiped his hands on his jeans, picked up the folder, and flipped through it. His eyebrows went up. Jesus. This is real. Every word. Tom whistled low. Yeah, he'll print it. Loves a good scandal. I nodded. Make sure he does. By the time I got home, the first storm clouds were rolling in. Yasmin was in the kitchen, pretending to read a magazine, but I could see the way her hands were too still, her back too straight. She was waiting for me to say something. I leaned against the counter, watching her. Busy day. She glanced up, forced a smile. Just errands. I nodded. Billings? Her fingers tensed against the magazine. Just slightly. No, just around town. I let the silence stretch. She knew. She didn't know how much I knew, but she knew something was coming. That night, I didn't climb into bed beside her. I slept in the guest room. Didn't say a word about it. Just let the silence do the work. The next morning, the Billings Gazette ran the story. Front page. Local developer tied to shady land deals. Fraud allegations under review. By noon, the whole damn town was talking. Rick's phone must have been blowing up, because by early afternoon, I got what I'd been waiting for. A text from him. Rick, Elias, we need to talk. I stared at the message, let it sit for a while, then typed back. Me, do we? A few minutes later, another message. Rick, it's not what you think. Please, I just need a chance to explain. Explain. Like there was anything left to say. I sent one last text. Me, meet me at the old sawmill at 6. Then I put my phone away and went outside. I had work to do. By the time I pulled up to the old sawmill on the edge of town, the sun was low, casting long shadows over the gravel lot. Rick was already there, pacing beside his car, running a hand through his slicked-back hair. He looked rattled. Good. I stepped out of my truck, took my time walking toward him. Didn't speak first. Let him squirm. He shoved his hands into his pockets, trying to play it cool. Elias, listen. No. He blinked. What? I took a step closer, just enough for him to feel it. You don't talk. You listen. Rick swallowed hard. You sat at my table, I said, voice steady. Shook my hand. Looked me in the eye, knowing damn well what you were doing. You think I didn't notice how you hovered around my wife? You think I'm some old fool? He opened his mouth, but I held up a hand. I don't care what excuses you've got. I don't care about your pathetic little love notes or your hotel receipts. What I care about is making sure you understand something. I leaned in just enough that he could see exactly what kind of man he was dealing with. This is just the beginning. Your name's ruined. Your business is circling the drain. And everyone in this town knows exactly what kind of man you are. Rick's jaw tensed. You set me up. No, Rick, I said, smiling just slightly. You set yourself up. I just turned on the lights. His face twisted, and for a second, I thought he might take a swing. Part of me hoped he would. But he wasn't that kind of man. He was the kind that ran when things got hard. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. This isn't over. I nodded. No, it ain't. Then I turned and walked away. By the time I got home, Yasmin was sitting at the kitchen table, eyes red, a glass of wine in front of her. She'd seen the news. She looked up when I walked in. Elias, I held up a hand. Don't. Just don't. She closed her mouth. I walked past her, grabbed a beer from the fridge, and headed to the porch. Sat down in my chair, cracked it open, and listened to the wind move through the trees. It wasn't over yet, but soon it would be. The town smelled blood. By the next morning, Rick's name was everywhere. The Billings Gazette article had started a landslide. His investors were pulling out, his business partners weren't returning his calls, and city officials who once lined their pockets off his deals were now pretending they never knew him. I heard from Tom that a few local businesses had coincidentally decided to cut ties with him, citing concerns about integrity. Integrity. Funny how people only cared about it when the tide turned. I was drinking my morning coffee on the porch when my phone rang. Yasmin. I let it ring. She tried again and I ignored it again. Third time I picked up. Her voice was tight, like she'd been holding back tears. Elias, please, can we just... No. A pause. A shaky breath. I need to talk to you. I stared out at the field, watching the wind ripple through the tall grass. Talk. Not like this. Please. Just meet me. The park. 1 hour. I didn't respond, just hung up. I got there before she did. Sat on one of the old wooden benches facing the creek. It was a quiet morning, just the sound of water and birds in the trees. Then I heard the sharp click of heels on pavement. She never used to wear heels to the park. She sat down next to me, folded her hands in her lap. She looked tired. Expensive makeup couldn't quite hide the dark circles, the tight set of her jaw. I know you hate me right now, she started. I said nothing. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. I made a mistake. I let the words sit between us for a long moment, then finally turned to look at her. You made a choice. She swallowed hard. Elias, No, I cut her off, my voice even. You don't get to rewrite this. Her fingers curled into fists, her composure cracking just slightly. You don't understand, I understand just fine, I said, turning my gaze back to the water. You wanted something different. Something exciting. Maybe you even convinced yourself you deserved it. And you thought you'd get away with it. She opened her mouth, then shut it. I shook my head, let out a dry chuckle. And now? Now you're not sorry for what you did, Yasmin. You're sorry you lost. She flinched like I'd hit her. That's not fair. No, I said, standing up, looking down at her. What's not fair is you thinking you could betray me and still have the life I built. Her face hardened. You think this makes you the better person? Destroying Rick's business, turning the town against me. I let a small, humorless smile slip. I didn't turn the town against you, Yasmin. You did that yourself. She exhaled sharply, blinking fast like she was trying to hold something in. I never wanted this to happen. I nodded. Yeah. Funny thing about choices. They come with consequences. She sat there, looking small for the first time in her life, staring down at her lap. I waited a beat, then turned and walked away. I didn't look back. By the time I got home, I had work to do. The farm wasn't going to run itself, and I wasn't about to sit around licking my wounds. That wasn't who I was. A few hours later, I heard the familiar sound of Tom's truck pulling up. He climbed out, dusting off his jeans, and made his way over to the porch, settling into the chair next to mine. She come clean? He asked, stretching out with a satisfied sigh. She tried, I said. Tom snorted. Figured. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a folded newspaper, and handed it to me. I took it, unfolded it, and scanned the front page. Rick Stevens resigns amid scandal, legal troubles loom. I exhaled through my nose, set the paper down on the table. That didn't take long. Nah, Tom said, sipping his beer. Man like him? Never built for the long haul. Built for shortcuts and easy money. I nodded, letting that sit. After a long silence, Tom cleared his throat. So what now? I looked out at the land, the fence that needed fixing, the rows of crops waiting to be tended. I work. Tom let out a low chuckle. Yeah, that sounds about right. We sat there for a while, not saying much. The sky stretched wide, the air smelled like rain on the horizon, and the world kept turning. And for the first time in a long time, I felt just fine. A week passed. Then another. Yasmin packed her things and left without much ceremony. No begging, no grand apologies. Just silence and the sound of suitcase wheels rolling across the hardwood floor. She didn't even ask for the house. She knew better. The town had made its decision, too. People like Yasmin and Rick didn't last long in places like Rockside. The kind of folks who prided themselves on integrity weren't quick to forgive betrayal, especially when it was served with a side of public disgrace. The invitations stopped. The friendly nods in the grocery store disappeared. She went from being the woman people admired to the woman they whispered about. Last I heard, she'd moved to Boise. Fresh start. Didn't matter to me. She wasn't my problem anymore. Rick didn't fare much better. His business collapsed in record time. The land deals unraveled, the investors bailed, and within a month, he was facing an investigation for fraud. Word was he tried to negotiate some kind of deal, but no one wanted to be seen standing next to him. I didn't care enough to follow up on the details. I had work to do. The farm kept me busy, which was exactly how I liked it. Every morning, I was up with the sun, hands in the dirt, mind on the land. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that woke a man up. I fixed fences, worked the fields, tended to the animals. My grandkids started coming around more. Sam, my oldest, brought his boy to help on weekends. You gonna teach him the ropes? He asked one Saturday, watching as the kid struggled with a bundle of hay. I grunted, handing the boy a pitchfork. He'll figure it out. That was the way of things. You learn by doing, by getting your hands dirty. No shortcuts. Then, one afternoon, I ran into Amelia Turner at the hardware store. She was picking up supplies for a project at the university, something about restoring an old historic building in town. We made small talk, nothing fancy, just two people who'd known each other a long time catching up. She mentioned reading the article about Rick. Didn't know you had a hand in that, she said, watching me carefully. I shrugged. Didn't do much. Just made sure the truth got out. She nodded like she understood more than I was saying. Good. He had it coming. A few days later, she stopped by the farm, dropping off a book she thought I'd like. Figured you could use something to read when you're not fixing fences. I smirked, flipping through the pages. What makes you think I got time to sit around reading? She leaned against the porch railing, arms crossed, that same knowing look in her eyes. Because you're too damn stubborn not to. I chuckled. She wasn't wrong. The visits became more frequent. She'd swing by with coffee, sometimes a loaf of homemade bread. We'd sit on the porch, talk about things that weren't tied to the past. She didn't pry, didn't ask for details I wasn't ready to give. She just showed up. One evening as the sun dipped low over the fields, she looked out over the land and let out a slow breath. You ever think about what's next? I took a sip of my beer, let the question settle. Not much point in thinking too far ahead. She smiled. Maybe. But doesn't hurt to have a direction. I consider that. I'd spent so much time focused on the wreckage, making sure justice was served, that I hadn't given much thought to what came after. But standing there, looking out over what I'd built, what I still had, I figured maybe she had a point. I glanced at her, tipped my hat. Guess I'll figure it out. And for the first time in a long time, I meant it. 6 months passed and the dust finally settled. Yasmin was gone, Rick was a ghost, and I was still standing. I got a letter from her once. Boise Post Gabriel, neat cursive on the envelope like nothing had changed. I didn't open it. Just tossed it into the fire and watched the paper curl into ash. Whatever she had to say, it wasn't worth hearing. Rick, from what I heard, tried to rebuild somewhere else, but a man like him doesn't bounce back from a fall like that. His name was poison, his reputation shot to hell. Last I heard, he was selling off assets, trying to keep the IRS off his back. Couldn't have happened to a better man. The farm thrived. Business was good, better than it had been in years. Blake helped set up an online store for our products, something I never would have thought to do. Turns out there were plenty of folks willing to pay top dollar for handcrafted goods from a Montana farm run by a grizzled old fireman, as he put it. Whatever worked. My kids and grandkids came around more. Sam brought his boy every weekend, and damned if that kid wasn't starting to get the hang of things. Stopped whining about the work, started moving with purpose. One day, after we finished stacking hay, he wiped the sweat off his forehead and looked up at me. Grandpa, how do you know when you're strong enough? I set down my gloves, cracked my knuckles. And about strength, boy. It's about standing your ground when it matters. He nodded like he understood. Maybe one day he would. Amelia kept showing up. She'd bring fresh bread, sit on the porch, talk about everything and nothing. It wasn't romantic, not in the way people might expect. There were no grand gestures, no whispered confessions. Just a woman who knew who she was, sitting across from a man who knew where he stood. One afternoon, she leaned back in her chair, watching the sky turn pink with the setting sun. You ever think about getting off this land for a bit? I smirked. And go where? She shrugged. Anywhere. Just to see something different. I thought about that. For the first time in a long time, the idea didn't seem ridiculous. Maybe, I said, watching the sky. She didn't push. Just nodded, sipped her coffee, and let the silence stretch between us. That night, I sat on the porch alone, watching the wind move through the trees. Everything was settled. Everything was as it should be. I didn't feel bitter. Didn't feel angry. Just steady. People like Rick and Yasmin, they spent their whole lives chasing something: status, attention, whatever it was that kept them moving like sharks in the water. They never knew what it meant to stand firm, to build something real. That's why they lost. Me? I had my land. My family. My name. I'd walked through the fire and came out the other side. And I was just getting started.